Inflation ticks upward again to 2.7% year over year, according to new data for June. Is this a sign, perhaps, of some early effects from President Trump's tariffs and trade wars? How will this affect the Fed Chair Jerome Powell's thinking about the economy? And how will that in turn affect the White House's thinking about the Fed and Jerome Powell?
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleague, columnist, and experienced Fed watcher, Joe Sternberg. The Bureau of Labor Statistics announced Tuesday morning that the Consumer Price Index had risen 2.7% year over year at the end of the month of June. Some notable increases: household furnishings and operations in June were up 1%. Apparel was up 0.4% in the month of June. And the battle for what these figures might mean was joined already before they even came out. Here is Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent on Bloomberg this morning before the CPI release.
I wouldn't put too much emphasis on one number. I think it's the trend. And I think one thing that Wall Street, a lot of economists, market in general got wrong early on was that tariffs were going to cause a substantial price level rise, which just hasn't happened.
Joe, what do you read? What are you seeing in this CPI report?
Kyle, I think Scott Bessent probably shouldn't be talking too much about trends at the moment, because those aren't really great in this report the more you dig into it. I mean, first off, you ticked off the headline number here, which is the all items, including food, energy, and the rest of it. And that was 2.7% compared to a year ago. Core inflation, which excludes food and energy and is the thing that economists love to talk about, even though it excludes a lot of what people actually buy, that ticked up 2.9%. So we are still way off of the 2% goal that the Federal Reserve says that they're aiming for. And then, I mean, if you go back to looking at the headline number and you look at what has been happening month to month, from May to June this year, prices went up 0.3%, and that's compared to 0.1% the month before, 0.2%, the month before that. So we're not seeing a clear downward drift in the inflation rate here. And, bearing in mind this baseline problem that you always have with inflation, which is that we're talking about a rate of change. Even if the inflation rate had been lower, prices would still be higher because, any positive inflation rate means that the price level has increased. And, this is on top of the price level increases of the past few years that the public still is trying to absorb. And so I don't think that there's really anything in here that the Trump administration can relax about. And I think that we're also seeing some of the effects of tariffs, because those items that you were talking about, household furnishings, that sort of thing, those are categories where we saw the most pronounced price increases in this report. Those are the items that are most likely to be imported from elsewhere, including China. And just as a political matter, those are the items where, I mean, if you were the consumer wandering down the aisle, your Walmart or your Home Depot or your Lowe's, buying stuff for your backyard right now in the height of the summer season, that is exactly the kind of item where you find yourself thinking, gosh, that is more expensive than I remember those being last year. So I think all around that this is a sign that something is not quite going right in the economy right now, and it's going not right in ways that are potentially a political problem for Trump.
And as a reminder, the reason that economists often exclude those volatile categories, food and energy, is not that they are not important purchases. They are. It's because they move around for reasons that are often unrelated to the overall general level of inflation. So if there's a energy problem, energy crisis, if there's a war in the Middle East, for example, that could change oil prices without really having anything to do with the monetary phenomenon of inflation in the United States. And so that is why economists often focus on that core number. Joe, aside from the potential tariff effect here, and it would still be pretty early in the overall push that President Trump is making to rebalance trade and pick all these fights with American trading partners. Is there also concern here just about the stickiness of the inflation that we experienced under Biden, which seems maybe not to have been entirely wrung out of the system yet?
Well, I mean, Kyle, the way I look at that is that there's always something, and that's kind of we're in the middle of what you could almost call there's always something inflation, because I mean, remember, first it was supply chains and the after effects of the pandemic, and then there was sort of this issue about whether, maybe some of all of that enormous amount of spending that we saw under the Biden administration might have been responsible for the inflation in some way. But some of the good news here is that the One Big Beautiful Bill Act has made headway in paring back some of the more inflationary elements of the Biden agenda, including some of the green subsidies that had really misallocated a lot of investment. We're gumming up the supply side of the economy in ways that could be inflationary. But no sooner do we have that kind of good policy news than we have the tariffs coming along. This is against the backdrop of a Federal Reserve that has made a lot of progress getting inflation under control, but still is pretty far off of their stated 2% target, and is finding it really difficult to go that last mile. And I think it's important to remember that economists and political types love chatting about these issues because there is the horse race element to, which horse is falling further behind or running more ahead in terms of dealing with the inflation issue, and what particular cause can you attribute the inflation to, and which party can you blame for that. But I mean, from the experience of your ordinary voter and consumer, all they are seeing is the prices in front of them when they go to the supermarket, when they go to the Home Depot, when they go to the Walmart, when they go to the Target. They just want it to stop. And so I think that there's this political point here where it is kind of interesting and, in a sense, important to parse out what is causing the inflation at any particular time, what policies might make it better. But as a political matter, I think that the Trump administration and congressional Republicans are going to have to remember that in the same way that inflation was so politically effective against the Democrats in the last election, it can now turn on Republicans in the next election.
And to underline that point, that the inflation monster eats wage increases, the Bureau of Labor Statistics also put out an earnings report, and it seems to show that. Here it is. Real average hourly earnings for all employees decreased 0.1% from May to June. This is a combination of an increase in wages earnings of 0.2%, plus that increase in the inflation, the consumer price index, of 0.3%. So the result of that is workers falling behind. Joe, how much do you think this new inflation number changes the thinking in the Federal Reserve about where rates should go here in the short term?
Well, I mean, the big question that we've had is what they're going to do at their meeting in a week or two, and whether we were going to see a rate cut. That's certainly what President Trump wants from them, and he has been pretty insistent, I think, to put it delicately, in applying pressure to Federal Reserve Chairman Jay Powell to deliver a rate cut. I think it's going to be very difficult for the Fed to do that under these circumstances. Now, we need to keep in mind that the consumer price index, which is the inflation measure that we're talking about right now, is not the specific measure that the Fed looks at. They're looking at something called the Personal Consumption Expenditure Index. That has tended to be a bit more subdued than the CPI. But I think that the clear message to the Fed is going to be that the fight against inflation is not done yet, and that there are a lot of potential headwinds that can feed into prices, particularly on the trade front. And I think that that they are probably going to move cautiously, at least this summer. And Trump is not going to be happy about that. We have to point out that Trump and congressional Republicans have done some good things that might end up bearing fruit here. I mean, you were talking, Kyle, about the real wage problem. The solution to that always is more business investment so that you can boost productivity growth. And so I think that the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, averting trillions of dollars in corporate tax increases, creating a firmer foundation for business investment, is probably a positive on that. But, those same businesses are also going to be fighting against the headwinds of the tariff policy, the very unpredictable trade policies that President Trump is pursuing. So I think that the real message from these data is that the fight against inflation is not over. That is a policy problem for the Fed. It is a political problem for everyone else.
On that point about Trump's pressure to cut rates, here he is today. Consumer prices low, bring down the Fed rate now. He later added on Truth Social, Fed should cut rates by 3 points. Very low inflation, $1 trillion a year would be saved. There's been also a lot of speculation about whether the president would move to fire Jay Powell. Let's listen again to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. This is him addressing that question this morning on Bloomberg.
President Trump said numerous times he's not going to fire Jay Powell. He's working the refs. And I've said before, I'm a basketball fan. There are two schools of working the refs. There's the Bobby Knight School and there's the Dean Smith School. President Trump seems to prefer the Bobby Knight School. And I'll tell you, I went back over the weekend and looked, and Bobby Knight won 3 NCAA championships. My hero, Dean Smith, only won 2.
Joe, what do you make of that? I like the analogy. On the other hand, it does seem sometimes that when Trump tries to work the refs, one response the refs can have is to try to stay pat and ensure that they are not signaling to the public that they are being worked by one of the teams on the court, to extend the analogy.
I mean, one of the ironies of the situation has been that Trump keeps making it really difficult for Jay Powell to do what Trump wants him to do. Because I think that a lot of people at the Fed probably at this point would be prepared to think about interest rate cuts, because, they would be looking at their economic models that might be telling them that even if the tariffs lead to an increase in the price level, it's going to be a one-off. The economy will end up absorbing it. We're not going to see the kind of persistent escalating inflation that we saw a few years ago. So I think that there's plenty of theoretical basis for the Fed to cut rates at this point if they wanted to. We could argue about the wisdom or otherwise of that. I personally actually don't think that interest rates are too high by historical standards right now. This is probably good for economic growth at their level. The trouble is that politically Trump just can't help himself, but make it impossible for Powell to deliver that. And I think it's because Trump, coming from a real estate background, is absolutely convinced that low interest rates are the solution for every problem. And he has never been known to keep his thoughts to himself on an issue like that. And that really makes it difficult for Powell to deliver rate cuts, even if he wanted to, because the Federal Reserve Chairman can't appear to be subject to that kind of political pressure. And there's a particular element of that political pressure lately, which is that Trump is talking a lot about debt service costs. It is true that the federal government is having to spend a lot more on interest to service the federal debt as interest rates have increased. That is generally what Trump is talking about when he says that rate cuts would, quote unquote, save money. That also is a really dangerous argument from the perspective of the Fed, because they don't want to appear that they are in cahoots with Treasury to tailor monetary policy for the convenience of fiscal policy. I think that, in fact, that kind of arrangement historically is what the idea of an independent central bank was supposed to combat. So, for all of these reasons, I think that Powell is going to find himself in a position where, precisely because Trump has been so insistent about rate cuts, it's going to be hard for him to deliver them.
I take that point, though. One other thought about what Trump might be doing is providing himself an opportunity later, if the economy goes south, to pin the blame on Jay Powell and say, it wasn't my tariffs, it wasn't my trade policies, it was the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is what got us into this mess. It's not my fault. It is interesting. I do wonder, despite the the message from the Trump administration that we are going ahead with the August 1st is now the Liberation Day tariff announcement. I do wonder how much thinking behind the scenes there might be when they look at this inflation number. They get a sense that rate cuts are probably not coming here at this next event. Whether that will factor into their decision about whether to plow forward with those August 1st tariff increases, or whether to do another Taco Tuesday and find some sort of accommodation with some of these trading partners, a way to save face.
I think you're right that there are probably people in the administration who would love to be able to shift the blame to anyone else if these policies end up not working out. And the Fed would be an obvious scapegoat. But I think that there are a bunch of political problems they're going to run into with that strategy. One of which is that the general public often has better things to do with their time than try to dig into the minutiae of monetary policy setting. So, we experience this quite often at times when the Fed has really deserved blame for economic failures, but it takes a lot of explaining and persuading, to bring the public along with that kind of message. And so I think that it's going to be even harder if that is the path we're headed down and the tariff policy doesn't go well, because Trump has talked about the tariff so much. So he is basically preemptively claiming credit for this policy because he thought it was going to work. That makes it really difficult for you then to disclaim responsibility for it if it becomes clear that it's not working. So I think that this whole blame shifting phenomenon, I mean, if everyone loves to blame the Fed, politicians like to try to do that. It tends really to only work in the situations where it is very obvious that the Fed was to blame for the problems. I mean, the Burns Fed of the late 70s is an example of that. I think that you can sort of talk now about how there's a bit of an understanding that the Bernanke Fed of the mid-2000s laid the foundations for the housing panic with their too low for too long policy. But, I just don't see the Fed being a viable scapegoat for a tariff policy gone awry.
A couple other related thoughts here. One is a new line of attack that President Trump and some of his allies are opening against Jay Powell. It has to do with some renovations to the Federal Reserve's Washington, D.C. headquarters. Very over budget. Some reports say hundreds of millions of dollars over budget. This project began in 2001. The estimate is something like $2.5 billion. Russ Vogt, the director of the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, recently said this on CNBC. This is about the largesse and the fact that he has systematically mismanaged the Fed. He also wrote a letter to Chairman Jay Powell and said, instead of attempting to right the Fed's fiscal ship, you've plowed ahead with an ostentatious overhaul of your Washington, D.C. headquarters. Joe, I haven't looked at this project to know enough about these claims of mismanagement, though. On one hand, an over-budget government project. What else is new? I mean, is there a there, or is this a just one more line of attack that Trump can open against somebody that he's opposed to?
Kyle, I think this is any other day in the Trump administration. We're going to have to be able to hold multiple thoughts in our head at the same time. So I think it can be simultaneously true that this is a preposterous project that has gone way over budget. People are comparing it as equivalent to the construction of the Palace of Versailles in 2025 dollars. So that is sort of the scale that we are looking at. The designs are just outrageously elaborate. They're building underground parking garages for themselves and underground concourses to connect to the various buildings in this complex that they've got on the north side of the National Mall. So yes, I mean, it sounds like a ridiculous project for a bureaucracy anywhere to be undertaking. It can also be true that in the grand scheme of things, we're not talking enormous amounts of money. I mean, if you're going to complain about a $3 billion building project in the context of the trillions of dollars worth of deficit spending that Congress has just passed, it's how excited can you really get about that? And it can also be true that this does not weigh on the Treasury because the Fed ends up paying for this out of its own resources. But at the same time, it can be true that this is not a good look for the Fed. I mean, part of the argument for Fed independence is that they're going to be a wise, not self-interested bureaucracy that will, exercise this awesome power over the economy in a very disinterested sort of arm's length way. And here they are behaving like any other bureaucracy on the face of the planet, building as nice a building for themselves as they can get. So no, I don't think that this is a good reason for trying to push Powell out, but I think that, it's also not a good look for the Fed.
Finally, what are you hearing, Joe, about the internal competition to be the next Jay Powell, the next Fed chair? A couple of contenders in the mix. Kevin Warsh is one that is talked about a lot. Some recent reporting by the Journal that White House economic advisor Kevin Hassett might be seriously in the running. What's your view of that choice that the president now has to make?
I think that there are clearly a bunch of people now under consideration for this. I mean, we also should note that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is a name that is floating around out there, as is David Malpass, who worked in the Treasury Department in the first Trump administration and also was head of the World Bank for a period. I think any of these are pretty serious economists. I think the question that you would have to ask is, and that they are going to ultimately have to answer to the public and to financial markets is, how independent could they be from the Trump White House or any other administration once they are in that job? And also, how committed are they to keeping inflation under control, which the voters keep screaming at the political class is the thing that voters really care about. And so I think that more than anything should be the basis on which Trump makes this decision. But, knowing how Trump operates, we can't be entirely sure that will end up being it. But I mean, that being said, if he's going to make a characteristically mercurial Trump decision here, at least all of the four finalists that we know of right now are serious people.
Thank you, Joe, and thanks for listening. You can email us your own Fed chair nominations at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.